Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles, FRS, was a British statesman, best known for his founding of the city of Singapore and the London Zoo. He is often described as the father of Singapore, and the father of the London Zoo. He was also heavily involved in the conquest of the Indonesian island of Java from Dutch and French military forces during the Napoleonic Wars and contributed to the expansion of the British Empire. He was also an amateur writer and wrote a book titled The History of Java. Early life: Raffles was born on the ship Anne off the coast of Port Morant, Jamaica, to Captain Benjamin Raffles and Anne Raffles. His father was a Yorkshireman who had a burgeoning family and little luck in the West Indies trade during the American Revolution, sending the family into debt. The little money the family had went into schooling Raffles. He attended a boarding school. In 1795, at the age of 14, Raffles started working as a clerk in London for the British East India Company, the trading company that shaped many of Britain's overseas conquests. In 1805 he was sent to what is now Penang in the country of Malaysia, then called the Prince of Wales Island, starting his long association with Southeast Asia. He started with a post under the Honourable Philip Dundas, the Governor of Penang. He was appointed Assistant Secretary to the new Governor of Penang in 1805 and married Olivia Mariam Fancourt, a widow who was formerly married to Jacob Casivlan Fancourt, an assistant surgeon in Madras who had died in 1800. At this time he also made the acquaintance of Thomas Otter Travers, who would accompany him for the next 20 years. His knowledge of the Malay language as well as his wit and ability, gained him favour with Lord Minto, Governor-General of India, and he was sent to Malacca. Then, in 1811, after the invasion and annexation of the Kingdom of Holland by France during Napoleon's War, Raffles had no choice but to leave the country. He mounted a military expedition against the Dutch and French in Java, Indonesia. The war was swiftly conducted by Admiral Robert Stopford, General Frederick Augustus Averell, and Colonel Rollo Gillespie, who led a well-organized army against an army of mostly French conscripts with little proper leadership. The previous Dutch governor, Herman Willem Dendels, had built a well-defended fortification at Meester Cornelis, and at the time, the governor, Jan Willem Janssens, mounted a brave but ultimately futile defense of the fortress. The British, led by Colonel Gillespie, stormed the fort and captured it within 3 hours. Janssens attempted to escape inland but was captured. The British invasion of Java took a total of 45 days, during which Raffles was appointed the Lieutenant Governor by Lord Minto before hostilities formally ceased. He took his residence at Buitenzorg and despite having a small subset of Britons as his senior staff, he kept many of the Dutch civil servants in the governmental structure. He also negotiated peace and mounted some significant military expeditions against local princes to subjugate them to British rule. Most significant of these was the 21 June 1812 assault on Yogyakarta, one of the two most powerful indigenous polities in Java. During the attack the Yogyakarta Kraton was badly damaged and extensively looted by British troops. Raffles seized much of the contents of the court archive. The event was unprecedented in Javanese history. It was the first time an indigenous court had been taken by storm by a European army, and the humiliation of the local aristocracy was profound. Although peace returned to Central Java in the immediate aftermath of the British assault, the events may have fueled the deep-seated instability and hostility to European involvement that ultimately gave rise to the Java War of the 1820s. Raffles also ordered an expedition to Palembang in Sumatra to unseat the local Sultan, Mahmud Badruddin II, and to seize the nearby Bangka Island to set up a permanent British presence in the area in the case of the return of Java to Dutch rule after the end of the War of the Sixth Coalition in Europe. During his lieutenant governorship, Raffles placed some restrictions on the local slave trade in line with wider British policy across its Asian territories, although slavery remained widespread and Raffles himself was served by a large retinue of slaves at his official residences in Java. Under Raffles' aegis a large number of ancient monuments in Java were systematically catalogued for the first time. The first detailed English-language account of Prambanan was prepared by Colin Mackenzie while Borobudur was surveyed and cleared of vegetation by H. C. Cornelius. Raffles also attempted a replacement of the Dutch system of forced agricultural deliveries in kind with a cash-based land tenure system of land management, probably influenced by the earlier writings of Dirk van Hogendorp. Under the harsh conditions of the island, his wife, Olivia, died on November 26, 1814, an event that devastated Raffles. In 1815, he left again for England shortly before the island of Java was returned to control of the Netherlands following the Napoleonic Wars, under the terms of the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1814. Raffles had been removed from his post by the East India Company ahead of the handover and officially replaced by John Fendall on account of the poor financial performance of the colony during his administration and allegations of financial impropriety on his own part. He sailed to England in early 1816 to clear his name and, en route, visited Napoleon, who was in exile at St Helena, but found him unpleasant and unimpressive. Interlude in England. In 1817, Raffles wrote and published a book entitled The History of Java, describing the history of the island from ancient times. In 1817 he was knighted by the Prince Regent, whose daughter, Princess Charlotte, was particularly close to him. At the publication of the book, he also stopped using the name Thomas, preferring to use his middle name, Stamford, possibly to avoid confusion amongst his associates with Sir Thomas Sylvester or his cousin Thomas Raffles who bore the same name. On February 22 he married his second wife, Sophia Hull. He was appointed as the Governor-General of Bencoolen on October 15, 1817, and set sail to take the post with his new wife. Bencoolen and Malaya. Raffles arrived in Bencoolen on March 19, 1818. Despite the prestige connected with the title of Governor-General, Bencoolen was a colonial backwater whose only real export was pepper, and only the murder of a previous resident, Thomas Parr, gained it any attention back home in Britain. Raffles found the place wrecked, and set about reforms immediately, mostly similar to what he had done in Java, abolishing slavery and limiting cockfighting and such games. To replace the slaves, he used a contingent of convicts, already sent to him from India. It is at this point when he realized the importance of a British presence that both challenged the Dutch hegemony in the area and could remain consistently profitable, unlike Bencoolen or Batavia. However, the strategic importance of poorly maintained but well-positioned British possessions such as Penang or Bencoolen made it impossible for the British to abandon such unprofitable colonies in such proximity to the Dutch in Java. The competition in the area, between Raffles and the aggressive Dutch de jure governor, Alout, certainly led at least in part to the later Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1824. Raffles looked into alternatives in the area, namely Bangka, which had been ceded to the Dutch after its conquest by the British during its occupation of Java. Bintan was also under consideration. Despite the fact that Francis Light overlooked the island before settling upon Penang in 1786, the Rio Archipelago was an attractive choice just to the south of the Malay Peninsula, for its proximity to Malacca. In his correspondences with Calcutta, Raffles also emphasized the need to establish a certain amount of influence with the native chiefs, which had greatly waned since the return of the Dutch. Raffles sent Thomas Travers as an ambassador to the Dutch, to possibly negotiate an expansion of British economic interests. When this failed, and when Raffles' own expeditions into his new dominion found only treacherous terrain and few exportable goods, his desire to establish a better British presence was cemented. However, the Anglo-Dutch Convention of 1814 was not completely clear, especially on the issue of certain possessions such as Padang. The Convention of 1814 only returned Dutch territory that was held before 1803, which did not include Padang. Raffles asserted the British claim personally, leading a small expedition to the Sultanate of Minangkabau Bay. Yet, as Raffles confirmed with the Sultan regarding the absolute British influence of the area, he realized that the local rulers had only limited power over the well-cultivated and civilized country, and the treaty was largely symbolic and had little actual force. Founding of Singapore. Meanwhile, Major William Farquhar, the British resident of Malacca, had been attempting to negotiate commercial treaties with the local chiefs of the Rio Archipelago, especially with the heads of the Sultanate of Johor. Due to the death and subsequent turmoil of the Sultanate at the time of Farquhar's arrival, Farquhar was compelled to sign the treaty not with the official head of the Sultanate, but rather, the Raja Muda of Riau. Noting it as a success and reporting it as such back to Raffles, Raffles sailed to Malacca in late 1818 to personally secure a British presence in the Riau area, especially Sinapra, which was favoured by him both through the readings of Malayan histories and by Farquhar's explorations. Despite Lord Hastings' less than stellar opinion of Raffles before, the now well-connected and successful Raffles was able to secure the permission to set up a settlement where in Malaysian history the name Lion City was applied and was in a strategically advantageous position. However, he was not to provoke the Dutch, and his actions were officially disavowed. Despite the best efforts in London by authorities such as the Viscount Castlereagh to quell Dutch fears and the continuing efforts to reach an agreement between the nations that eventually became the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of London of 1824, as well as to send instructions to Raffles to undertake far less intrusive actions, the distance between the Far East and Europe had meant that the orders had no chance of reaching Raffles in time for his venture to begin. Singapore, establishment. After a brief survey of the Karimun Islands, on January 29, 1819, he established a post at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. It was established that there was no Dutch presence on the island of Singapore. Johor also no longer had any control of the area, so contact was made with the local Temenggung, or Raja. The contacts were friendly and Raffles, knowledgeable about the muddled political situation, took advantage to provide a rudimentary treaty between the nominal chiefs of the area that called for the exclusivity of trade and the British protection of the area. Members of Raffles' party surveyed the island and proceeded to request the presence of the Sultan, or whoever at the time had supreme nominal power, to sign a formal treaty, while Major Farquhar was ordered to do the same in Hio. A few days later, the formal treaty was signed by a man who claimed to be the lawful sovereign of the whole of territories extending from Lingga and Jaya to Mount Mawar. This man was Hussein Shah of Johor, who, although having had no previous contact with the British, had certainly heard of the might of the British Navy and was in no position to argue against the terms. However, Raffles was able to charm the man and to reassure him that the Dutch posed no threat in the area. Hussein Shah had been the Crown Prince of Johor, but while he was away in Pahang to get married, his father died and his younger brother was made Sultan, supported by some of the court officials and the Dutch. To circumvent the situation of having to negotiate with the Sultan influenced by the Dutch, Raffles decided to recognize, on behalf of the British Crown, Hussein Shah as being the rightful ruler of Johor. Farquhar's attempt to establish a more favourable treaty in Hio was met with greater challenge, as the Dutch were present and made for a rather awkward position. The Dutch were alarmed and sent a small contingent to the island. Despite a cover offer of subterfuge against the Dutch offered by the Raja of Hio, Farquhar returned and an official protest was sent by the Raja to Java regarding the matter. Raffles declared the foundation of what was to become modern Singapore on February 6, securing the transfer of control of the island to the East India Company. With much pomp and ceremony, the official treaty was read aloud in languages representing all nations present, as well as the Malay and Chinese inhabitants. Hussein Shah was paid $5,000 a year while the local Temenggung received $3,000 a year, both massive sums at the time, equivalent to several $100,000 now. Farquhar was officially named the Resident of Singapore as Raffles was named as agent to the most noble the Governor-General with the states of Hio, Linjin and Johor. Although ownership of the post was to be exclusively British, explicit orders were given to Farquhar to maintain free passage of ships through the Strait of Singapore and a small military presence was established alongside the trading post. After issuing orders to Farquhar and the remaining Europeans, Raffles left the next day, February 7, 1819. Achin, and the early conflict with the Dutch, Raffles also planned to start a British presence in Achin, at the northern tip of Sumatra. As soon as he left, the Raja of Hio sent letters to the Dutch, claiming innocence and a British encroachment. The Dutch in Malacca acted at once, and ordered that no Malays could go to Singapore. Raffles' bold claim of Singapore created a curious geographic situation where although Penang was clearly closer distance-wise to Singapore, Raffles, in his capacity as the Governor-General of Bencoolen, was in control. This undoubtedly irked the authorities in Penang to the point where they refused to send any sepoys to Singapore to complete the garrison. Official Dutch complaints came before the end of the month, and Raffles attempted to appease the situation by instructing Farquhar to not interfere with the politics of surrounding islands. Despite numerous threats and serious considerations by the Dutch Governor-General in Java, the Dutch did not take any military action. The muddled political situation in Johor and Hio also created a certain uneasiness and instability for the two nations. Tengku Long was claimed to be a pretender to the throne, and, since the succession laws in the Malay Sultanates were not clear-cut, the treaties signed between native rulers and the European powers always seemed to be on the verge of being invalidated, especially if a sultan is deposed by one of his siblings or other pretenders. Nevertheless, amidst the uncertainty and intrigue, Raffles landed in Achin on March 14, 1819, with the begrudging help of Penang. Once again, it seems that multiple people were in power, but none wanted to formally deal with the British. The hostile atmosphere created allowed for Raffles to cancel the only meeting he was able to arrange, with Panglima Polim, a powerful divisional chief, fearing treachery. As the influential merchant John Palmer, Raffles, and fellow Commissioner John Monckton Coombs of Penang sat offshore, waiting for a response, Calcutta debated whether to reinforce Singapore or not. Evacuation plans were made, but the Dutch never acted, and finally Lord Hastings prompted Colonel Ban Nerman, the governor of Penang, to send funds to reinforce Singapore. Raffles finally was able to convince his fellow commissioners to sign a treaty with Jur al-Alam Shah, the ruler of Achin, which placed a British resident as well as the exclusivity of trade. By the time Raffles returned to Singapore, on May 31, much of the immediate crisis that the establishment of the colony had caused in Penang and Calcutta had passed. By then, the initial 500 villagers had grown to become 5,000 merchants, soldiers, and administrators on the island. Raffles was determined to destroy the Dutch monopoly in the area and create a gateway to the trade with China and Japan, the latter of which he had attempted and failed to reach while governing Java. First year of Singapore. While in Singapore, Raffles established schools and churches in the native languages. He allowed missionaries and local businesses to flourish. Certain colonial aspects remained. A European town was quickly built to segregate the population, separated by a river. Carriage roads were built and cantonments constructed for the soldiers. Otherwise, however, no duties were imposed, and confident that Farquhar would follow his instructions well, he sailed for Bencoolen once again on June 28. Bencoolen, once again, Raffles was still the Governor-General of Bencoolen, and having returned to it after the settling of Singapore, Raffles started more reforms that were, by now, almost trademarks of his reign upon colonies. Forced labor was abolished when he first arrived, and he declared Bencoolen a free port as well. Currency was regulated, and as he had an excess of out-of-work civil servants, formed committees to advise him in the running of the colony. However, Bencoolen was not as self-sufficient as Singapore. The area was poor and disease-ridden, and the first reports from the committees reflected very poorly upon the condition of the colony. Unlike the salutary neglect Raffles granted upon Singapore, he slowed the European-inspired reforms and emphasized on the cultivation of whatever land that was available. Native authorities were given power in their respective districts and were answerable only to the Governor-General. The slave debtor system was brought in, instead of the old slavery system that Raffles abolished in Java, Borneo, and initially in Bencoolen. Slave debtors were registered, and educational reform started to focus on the children instead of the entire population. Raffles was looking into a long-term plan for a slow reform of Bencoolen. Unlike many other European colonizers, Raffles did not impose upon the colonized the language, culture, or other aspects of the colonizer. In addition to preserving the artifacts, fauna, and flora of his colonies, he also allowed religious freedom in his colonies, especially important as the Malay states were largely Muslim. However, Christian schools were started by missionaries in all of his colonies. Consolidation of the Eastern Isles. The death of Colonel Ban Nerman of Penang in October 1819 brought upon a new opportunity for Raffles to expand his power to also include the other minor British factories and outposts from Sumatra to Cochin China. He sailed to Calcutta and as Lord Hastings sought to consolidate all of the small British possessions in the East Indies. During his sojourn, he had the opportunity to argue for free trade and the protection of the private enterprise. Education and the retention of small British outposts were also discussed. The Dutch claim on the Sultanate of Johor and hence, Hio, and the diplomatic exchanges between Baron Godard van der Capellen in Calcutta continued throughout this time. The legitimacy of the British treaties were also questioned once again, but finally, as Singapore grew at an exponential rate, the Dutch gave up their claim on the island, allowing the colony to continue as a British possession. However, the pressures put upon Calcutta ensured that no single governor of all British possessions in the Strait or on Sumatra was appointed, and Raffles, whose health was slowly ailing, returned to Bencoolen. Administration of Bencoolen, 1820–1822, Raffles returned to Bencoolen in ill health, but as his health improved, he continued on his quest to learn about the island he now called home. He studied the Batak cannibals of Tapanuli and their rituals and laws regarding the consumption of human flesh, writing in detail about the transgressions that warranted such an act as well as their methods. He also noted the rise of the Sikh religion in certain parts of Sumatra. By early 1820, Tunku Long had firmly established himself as the Sultan of Johor to the British, but the political situation in the area remains a befuddled mess, with the old Sultan dying and many new ones attempting to gain either the crown or regency. As Farquhar was involving himself poorly in local politics, Raffles appointed Travers as the resident of Singapore, replacing Farquhar. Upon his arrival, Travers found the colony a delightful small paragraph board of different races and cultures, numbering over 6,000, and the Singapore trade was slowly overtaking the Java trade. As in Java, Raffles collected samples of local species of plants and animals, as well as described them in his journals. He also described other local tribes and their customs, especially their religions and laws. He brought the island of Nias under British rule as well, noting its more civilized state and production of rice. Yet, the production of food remained somewhat of a problem in Bencoolen. Raffles paid special attention to the agricultural methods of the Chinese, and wrote an introduction to the only issue of proceedings of the Agricultural Society, in order to remedy this. His employer, the East India Company, however, had no other concerns outside of profit, and even as Raffles lived like a country gentleman and ran his colony as an estate, his expenditures in natural preservation was frowned upon. His removal was discussed in both Calcutta and London, while Castlereagh continued negotiations with the Dutch regarding the ongoing diplomatic conflicts. Luckily, the Singapore issue had its supporters in the House, so as negotiations went on in Europe, Raffles remained largely idle in Bencoolen. The only major issue, outside of the politics of local sultans, involved the replacement of Farquhar, who decided that he had no intention of leaving his post voluntarily, causing a moment of tension between him and Travers. Raffles' request for Travers to deliver dispatches to India nullified the issue late in the year, and Farquhar remained in charge in Singapore, with its survival still in doubt for many in both India and London, who believed that it would either be handed over to the Dutch or taken violently by the Dutch at the end of Castlereagh's negotiations. Farquhar, however, stirred up more trouble, conflicting especially with local English merchants over trivial matters of self-importance and overreaction over small infractions of white traders, for some of which he was reprimanded by Calcutta officially. Public works, commissioned by Raffles but undertaken by Farquhar, was becoming overwhelmingly expensive. Personal tragedies also started for Raffles. His eldest son, Leopold, died during an epidemic on July 4, 1821. The oldest daughter, Charlotte, was also sick with dysentery by the end of the year, but it would be his youngest son, Stamford Marston, who would perish first with the disease, January 3, 1822, with Charlotte to follow 10 days later. For the good part of 4 months the couple remained devastated. The year would be eventful with the suicide of Castlereagh and the appointment of Lord Amherst as the Governor-General of India, replacing Hastings. As Raffles grew restless and depressed, he decided to visit Singapore before heading home to England. Accompanying him would be his wife Sophia and their only surviving child, Ella. Singapore. Raffles was pleased at the fact that Singapore had grown exponentially in such a short period of time. The colony was a bustling hub of trade and activity. However, Farquhar's development work was deemed unsatisfactory and Raffles drew up what is now known as the Jackson Plan, and replanned the city according to recommendations of a committee headed by the colony's engineer, Philip Jackson. It was still a segregated plan, giving the best land to the Europeans, yet it was considered remarkably scientific for the time. It was also during the replanning and reconstruction of the town that allowed Farquhar to clash dramatically with Raffles, who now considered Farquhar unfit for the position of resident. Raffles took direct control with a heavy hand. In 1823, Raffles instituted a code of settlement for the populace, and soon followed with laws regarding the freedom of trade. He also quickly instituted a registration system for all land, regardless of ownership, and the repossession of the land by the government if land remained unregistered. This act greatly asserted the power of the British government as it covered land previously owned by the Sultan as well. A police force and magistracy were then set up on British principles. Raffles had turned the trading post into a proper city with some semblance of order. Repeated efforts by Raffles for Calcutta to send a replacement for Farquhar remained unanswered. As Raffles started to hint at his impending retirement, he made Johor a British protectorate, causing a protest from Van der Capellen. Finally, Calcutta appointed John Crawford, who had followed Raffles for over 20 years, as the resident of Singapore. Captain William Gordon Mackenzie took over Bencoolen from Raffles. In March 1823, and coincidentally, on the same day he was replaced, he received an official reprimand from London for the takeover of Nias. With politics against him, Raffles finally turned back to the natural sciences. He gave a speech regarding the opening of a Malay college in Singapore that heavily involved his observations of his years in Southeast Asia and the importance of both the local and the European languages. Raffles personally gave $2,000 towards the effort, as the East India Company gave $4,000. In 1823, Raffles drafted the first constitution for Singapore, which followed a fairly moralistic stance, outlawing gaming and slavery. A specific regulation in the constitution called for the multi-ethnic population of Singapore to remain as is, and there shall be no crimes based on race. He then went to work drafting laws, defining exactly what constituted a crime. Finally, on July 9, 1823, feeling that his work in establishing Singapore was finished, he boarded a ship for home, but not before a stop in Batavia to visit his old home and adversary, Van der Capellen. A final stop in Bencoolen followed, and finally, a voyage home, interrupted by a harrowing experience when one of the ships caught fire off Rat Island, which claimed many of his drawings and papers. The Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1824 finally settled the score in the East Indies. The British gained dominance in the north, while the entirety of Sumatra became Dutch. The Malay Peninsula and the Indian subcontinent were both free of Dutch interference. Raffles finally returned to England on August 22, 1824, over a year after he left Singapore. His longest tenure in Singapore was only 8 months, but he was considered the founder of Singapore nevertheless. England and death. Upon arrival in England in poor health, Sir Stamford and Lady Raffles convalesced in Cheltenham until September 1824, after which he entertained distinguished guests in both London and his home. He also made plans to run for Parliament, but this ambition was never realised. He moved to London to a house in Berners Street at the end of November 1824, just in time to have a war of words in front of the Court of Directors of the EIC regarding Singapore with Farquhar, who had also arrived in London. Despite raising several severe charges against Raffles, Farquhar was ultimately unable to discredit him. He was denied a chance to be restored to Singapore, but was given a military promotion instead. With the Singapore matter settled, Raffles turned to his other great interests, botany and zoology. Raffles was a founder and first president of the Zoological Society of London and the London Zoo. Meanwhile, he was not only not granted a pension, but was called to pay over £22,000 for the losses incurred during his administrations. Raffles replied and clarified his actions, and moved to his country estate, Highwood, North London, but before the issue was resolved, he was already much too ill. He died at Highwood House in Mill Hill, North London, a day before his 45th birthday, on July 5, 1826, of apoplexy. His estate amounted to around £10,000, which was paid to the company to cover his outstanding debt. Because of his anti-slavery stance, he was refused burial inside his local parish church by the vicar, Theodore Williams, whose family had made its money in Jamaica in the slave trade. A brass tablet was finally placed in 1887 and the actual whereabouts of his body was not known until 1914 when it was found in a vault. When the church was extended in the 1920s, his tomb was incorporated into the body of the building and a square floor tablet with inscription now marks the spot. Raffles was survived by his second wife Sophia Hull and daughter Ella, and predeceased by his other 4 children and Ben Coulon. Ella died in 1840, aged 19. Sophia remained at Highwood House until her death in 1858, at the age of 72. Her tomb and memorial may be seen in St. Paul's Church graveyard, Mill Hill, close to the rear door of the church. Memorial sculpture in Westminster Abbey, London, England. A life-size figure in white marble by Sir Francis Chantrey depicts Raffles in a seated position. The sculpture was completed in 1832 and it is in the North Choir aisle. Legacy: in Singapore and in other parts of the world, his name lives on in numerous entities, including biology. Chuitodon rafflesii, latticed butterfly fish, Dinopium rafflesii, olive-backed woodpecker, Megalima rafflesi, red-crowned barbet, Nepenthes rafflesiana, a species of pitcher plant, Protonella rafflesi Taylor, 1990. A species of ant, Raffles Museum of Biodiversity Research, Rafflesia, a genus of parasitic flowering plants, known for having the largest flowers in the world, Thorigion rafflesi Simon, 1899. A spider from Sumatra, Raffles gave the scientific name to Macaca fascicularis, also known as the crab-eating macaque, and also the scientific name of the lesser mouse deer. Landmarks: Raffles City, Raffles Hospital, Raffles Hotel, Business, Raffles Holdings, Raffles Medical Group, Yantai Raffles Shipyard, Education, Raffles College, Raffles College of Design and Commerce, Raffles Girls Primary School, Raffles Girls School, Raffles Institution, Sports and Recreation, Raffles Cup, Transport, Raffles Institution Lane, Raffles Lighthouse, Raffles Place MRT Station, Stamford Road. Further reading: E. W. Brayley. Some Account of the Life and Writings and Contributions to Science, of the late Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles, K.N.T., F.R.S., S.A. and L.S., and C. Successively Lieutenant Governor of Java and its dependencies, and of Fort Marlborough, Singapore, and the British possessions in Sumatra, founder and president of the Zoological Society. The Zoological Journal 3, 1 €48 E. W. Brayley. Some Account of the Life and Writings and Contributions to Science, of the late Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles, K.N.T., F.R.S., S.A. and L.S., and C. Successively Lieutenant Governor of Java and its dependencies, and of Fort Marlborough, Singapore, and the British possessions in Sumatra, founder and president of the Zoological Society. The Zoological Journal 3, 382 €400 Chandler, David P. Steinberg, David J. In Search of Southeast Asia. University of Hawaii Press. ISBN A978-0-8248-1110-5. Würzburg, Charles E. Raffles of the Eastern Isles. Oxford University Press. ISBN A0-19-582605-1. De Jong, Dupe. De Warrior van het Fortuin. SDU Publishers. ISBN A90-12-08974-3. Glendinning, Victoria. Raffles and the Golden Opportunity. Profile Books. ISBN A978-1846686,030. Nigel Barley, The Golden Sword, Stamford Raffles and the East, British Museum Press, 1999. ISBN 0-7141-2542-3. Nigel Barley, In the Footsteps of Stamford Raffles, Monsoon, Singapore. 2009. ISBN 978-981-08-3534-7. Murdoch, Adrian, Raffles, Three Lives, Rot Publishing, 2013. The Scene BOOAWCMB 62. Nolte, H. J. Raffles Arc Redrawn, Natural History Drawings from the Collections of Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles. British Library Publishing. ISBN A978-0-7123-5084-6. See also. History of Singapore, Raffles Landing Site. References. External links, Biography at the Raffles Museum of Biodiversity Research, find a grave profile for Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles, The Natural History of Game Birds by Sir William Jardine with a memoir on Sir Stamford Raffles, The History of Java by Sir Stamford Raffles at the Internet Archive. Raffles and the Golden Opportunity, The Guardian, December 5, 2012.